Before we get started, we will be recording today's session so that we can share it with those that are unable to join us live. So it will be shared just with the Better Futures Australia community as an unlisted YouTube video. So if you have any concerns about that afterwards, please do reach out and let us know. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining this call from Yagara and Turrbal country in Meanjin, which I'm privileged to call my home, and I pay my deep respects to elders past and present. Grateful for their wisdom in caring for this land so that we can continue to enjoy its benefits today. And may we all continue to honour their example in stewarding the country we all have the privilege to call our home. And as we gather here today, let's also take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the upcoming voice referendum. It's an opportunity to recognise and amplify our First Nations community and voices, allowing us to identify ways we can be a more inclusive and united community and work together to create futures that provide better outcomes for us all. So I'd like to invite you all to acknowledge the various countries you're calling in from in the chat and introduce yourselves to others on the call. So just a bit of an overview of how today's roundtable will unfold. First, we'll hear from a member of the UN Climate Champions team, Tessa Vincent, the Race to Zero Policy and Engagement Lead. So Tessa is based in the UK, so she's shared a pre-record statement with us that she sent through overnight, just to share their insights from the UN Climate Ambition Summit that's currently underway. And after that, we'll hand over to the Climate Action Network Australia CEO, Glenn Klotowski, and he'll provide an update from the ground in the Big Apple. So we'll have some time for questions with Glenn after that. So I will just share my screen to share that update with you all from Tessa. One moment.
Hi, Better Futures Australia, and thank you, Lisa, for the invitation today. My name is Tessa Vincent, and I am the Policy and Engagement Lead for the Race to Zero campaign, which is rallying over 12,000 non-state actors around the world to commit to halving emissions by 2030. And we're really pleased to be working in collaboration with Better Futures Australia, who are one of the accelerators of the Race to Zero through the Alliances for Climate Action. So today I'm going to share with you some priorities from our UN climate change high-level champions at Climate Week New York, and some insights on developments on net zero policy and regulation. So our champions, Her Excellency Razan Al-Mubarak and Dr. Mahmoud Mahildin, are there in New York right now, involved in both the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit and a number of events. But they have 5 priorities. Those are measuring progress, adaptation and resilience, highlighting work through the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda and Race to Resilience, investing in nature, releasing a report in collaboration with Systemic on techniques and priorities to invest in nature-based solutions, empowerment and inclusion, particularly the rights of Indigenous people, and finally, net zero leadership, and particularly putting a spotlight on net zero policy and regulation. So this is the area that I work in, and I want to share with you some positive case studies, some stories over the last couple of weeks that are moving us from voluntary action to the policy and regulation that we need in order to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. So first, you may have seen that California released a new bill, first of its kind in the United States, committing to make reporting mandatory on greenhouse gas emissions for their largest companies. And Apple, interestingly, came out in support of this legislation, showing the important role that you and others in the room can take to push governments to go further and faster on climate action. In the UK, I joined a march last Friday with 500 business people calling on the UK government to go further on ending fossil fuels, increasing renewable energy investment, and protecting nature. And then finally, you may have seen this week that Influence Map released their 27 leading climate companies on climate advocacy and engagement. So I'd really recommend you look at Influence Map's work and have a look at these stories on positive climate advocacy and developments on net zero policy and regulation. Wishing you all the best for this discussion today. As you can tell, it's close to home. I'm from down under, from New Zealand, and really pleased to be working with Better Futures Australia on this race to net zero. Thanks.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening in to Tessa's update. And if any of your organizations would like to connect in with the Climate Champions team, just let us know. Happy to facilitate that. We did have some useful discussions with the Climate Champions community and Alliance members overseas from Canada and other places, just trying to delve into net zero policy frameworks and structures that could translate to domestic economies around the world. So some really useful forums and discussions underway there. So please do reach out if curious about any of that. So I think we're still waiting on Glenn to join us. He must be tied up and distracted at the summit. So just for those of us who've just joined us, we are recording this event for those that aren't able to make it today. Please do keep your cameras on for that social connection if you can, and stay muted unless you're speaking to everyone. And make use of the chat window for capturing any questions and comments, because we do have time allocated for Q&A and discussion, so we'll do our best to come back to those. So it was great to hear from Tessa Vincent, the Race to Zero Policy and Engagement Lead, and now we'll jump to a quick update on the Better Futures Australia initiative, and then if Glenn joins us, we'll jump to him. But otherwise, very excited and keen to hear updates from our stellar lineup of sector representatives on the call today. So a couple of new faces here. Wonderful to meet you all and bring you into the Better Futures Australia community. We are a non-partisan alliance of climate champions aiming to represent every sector of society and the economy. We're ready to work together, including with all levels of government, to exceed Australia's climate ambition and commitments. So over the past 2 years, Better Futures Australia has conducted these quarterly multi-sectoral meetings. These meetings give us a chance to pause and reflect on the positive developments underway and consider how we can collectively work together to address the remaining obstacles in Australia's climate landscape. Through this Better Futures Australia community, we're fortunate to work with various sector working groups and partner initiatives dedicated to supporting the federal government's efforts in delivering ambitious climate responses. We have around 8 speakers on the call with us today who'll share speedy updates and insights, helping us form a comprehensive view of key developments in Australia's climate and energy landscape currently underway. So these speakers have been invited to cover key initiatives, their policy advocacy priorities, any upcoming events or key moments that we should be aware of, the expectations they have for Australia heading into the COP28 global climate negotiations in Dubai this December, and any collaboration opportunities. So areas where cross-sectoral collaboration and support to amplify their advocacy efforts can help us with that collective impact. So has Glenn joined us yet, Jordan, or no? Okay. We will jump to the round of updates. So we have with us, I'll do this in order because we have some people that need to jump off. Anna Mallas from Climate Works Centre, who's joining us to provide an update on the critical work that they're doing, in particular with corporate and finance stakeholders. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Sorry, I buried the window. So yes, just a quick introduction to me. For those of you who don't know me, I am Climate Work Centre's Australian country lead, and that means I work across the organisation to kind of understand trends and dynamics, understand how that relates to our work, and support kind of across the organisation our work to be most effective and have most impact in Australia. And so I'm going to talk to you about a few things quickly, which is particularly our work on sustainable finance and mandated disclosure, including kind of what's now being known as credible transition plans. So worth noting that Climate works kind of from our own initiative, often with philanthropic funding, but also through various collaborations and coalitions. And we do sometimes do commissioned work, both for kind of businesses, for governments, and for alliances. So this idea about credible transition plans, they're also known as kind of net zero plans. And it's sort of twofold on this. So initially that started with voluntary work from various leaders in corporates, but it's now connected to the emerging mandatory disclosure around climate risk and financial risk, and that mandatory disclosure will not just be about reporting of risk, but also about these credible transition plans. Through our work on the net zero momentum tracker, we have looked previously at what makes a good transition plans, and it's things like ensuring those plans are tied into the sector's requirements to get Australia to net zero on, in line with 1.5 and at least cost, and also to make sure that whatever the company is doing, they're doing it in the right order. So that idea about a hierarchy, about reducing your own emissions first before you think about doing offsetting, and also ensuring that this reporting is not just about, and an action plan is not just about scope 1 and 2, but also about, the people you're buying from or organizations you're buying from and the customers you're selling to, those scope 3 emissions. I should note that on the call, we've got Mandy Barber. She's in our corporates team, so she's doing a lot of this work and, probably in dismay at how I'm butchering the messaging of it, but she's just started. So we thought it was better that, because I have the broader broader perspective, I'd do this. But most of this you would probably connect with Mandy or the rest of the team. So we are working with the Climate Leaders Coalition, which is chief execs from a whole range of high emitting industries and others, and that covers 27% of the emissions of this country, and that's particularly about this idea of credible transition plans, and they're aiming to publish their commitment to disclose those plans by the end of 2024, but they'll publish their commitment this year. And other ones also worth mentioning, the whole idea of the sustainable finance taxonomy and how that connects into credible science-based and sector-specific pathways, and that those pathways are done for Australia. We're working on those pathways in a number of ways. We're revisiting our work on that, so we'll be publishing this year updated pathways. We're also working with the CCA about their work on pathways. At the moment, that's not commissioned work, just to be clear, even though they're working with CSIRO on models that we use. Also worth noting, in that pathways area, we're doing a lot of work in the land space about something that's known as the LUTO model. So that's an Australian specific land use model. We're hoping to update that, working with Deakin and others. and so that we can have much better and more appropriate land-based targets and land-based pathways. And on, yeah, that I'll probably leave that there about kind of the finance and corporate work, but just, say we're always interested in collaborating, so get in touch. And on kind of COP28, we will, ClimateWorks is officially part of Monash. We'll be going in, so there's two possibilities about the way we participate. One is as on that kind of education, academic research side, and the other is on the more kind of influencing side. So we are aiming to be part of both events at the Australia Pavilion, but also Monash University for the first time is having a pavilion, and so also aiming to do events there. In terms of influencing, obviously with Australia seeking to host COP31, we're very mindful of how that can be used as a kind of, lever opportunity, but also making sure we think now about what is it that good looks like. So what should that Australian hosted COP look like? What commitments should Australia be making sort of now in the next few years and at that COP, but also in particular what that looks like for kind of beyond government stakeholders. That was a very quick trot through, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Anna. And yeah, it's an incredible team at ClimateWorks Centre and representation across all of Better Futures Australia's working groups. So greatly appreciate all the valuable contributions. And yeah, Jo Sanson is one of the key people at ClimateWorks behind the nature-based solutions working groups. So lots of fundamental thinking and consideration around how Australia can restructure our approach to nature-based solutions for climate and the whole biodiversity climate nexus. So some really big conversations happening, and yeah, important thinking and work underway to try and carve a better way forward in all of these climate spaces. So yeah, a lot of great insights there, Anna, from the complexities at play. So thank you for all you're doing, and very keen for those transition pathways to come out. So please do give us all a heads up for how we can help amplify that.
Yeah, we will do. And I'm sorry, a couple of things that are kind of, and also we are doing some work to get our own thinking up to speed about, the idea of equivalency. So exactly how you deal scientifically with land-based sequestration and how that relates into, emissions, because as we know, it's not a simple story. And so we are doing thinking on that at the moment, and sort of watch this space in terms of, one, us reaching out to people to understand who's done work on that, but also the possibility of doing some kind of, roundtables or other on that. And then one other thing, Mandy is also leading our work on trying to get a more complex and sort of better idea of how we should be engaging with First Nations people in our work. And so Mandy will probably be in touch with some of the people on this call to see how you do it, and therefore how we should be doing this a lot better than we do already. Thanks.
Excellent. So glad to hear that. Thanks, Anna. So now I have the pleasure to introduce you all to Rowan Morey from Beyond Zero Emissions to share with us an update on behalf of the Transport Working Group through Climate Action Network Australia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Lisa. Yes, I'm Rowan, and I'm a co-convener of the Transport Working Group. We meet once a month and facilitate collaboration, connection, and information between climate groups focused on reducing transport emissions. We're made up of a variety of groups, from large national climate organizations to smaller grassroots community-focused active transport groups. We typically hear from a guest speaker each month on an important topic and issue. We recently heard from Mark Dean from the Australian Manufacturers Workers Union speak about the Zero Emissions Vehicle Innovation Council and how local manufacturers are taking their policies to grow their local industry in that space. We also have two sub-working groups at the moment. So one's focused on active transport, they've been working together on a recent Transport Equity Week, which happened earlier this month. It's calling for better public transport services and infrastructure, which hopes to enable more people with different abilities to use public transport, and in areas where there's a lack of public transport to have access to that public transport. The second is focused on fuel efficiency standards. There are ensuring that a strong fuel efficiency standard is introduced, as well as with an ambitious target and with as few loopholes as possible. And lastly, we had a terrific symposium last month, the day before the CANA organization, the CANA meeting, and we brought in lots of different organizations. We had civil society, government, and different people from universities to talk about the upcoming national net zero strategy and roadmap on transport, and how we could, as a group, best influence that work and come out with a stronger actions from that strategy. So yeah, get in touch if you want to be a part of that working group. I actually have to jet off soon because we have our monthly meeting in 30 minutes, but we'll be working together to make sure we can come up with ways to better influence that strategy over the next couple of months when it's introduced early next year. Thank you.
Excellent timekeeping there, Rowan. That was beautiful. And please do, everyone, post any questions or discussion topics you'd like to pursue with Anna or Rowan and their teams in the chat, and we can help facilitate a follow-up for you. So thank you so much. So next, I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Hudson Wesley from Precinct, the chair of the, I hope you're still the chair, Hudson, of the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. So I haven't had an update from you in quite a while. It's usually Monica that joins us. So very, very glad to see your happy, smiling face with us today. Thanks, Hudson.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I'm very happy to say I'm still the chair. I love the job. So Materials Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance is a collaboration between WWF and Climate Kick and my consultancy Precinct. We looked at embodied carbon in the construction and infrastructure sectors and saw that as a bit of a missing piece on the journey to circularity, and certainly an area where we really need to reduce emissions to get close to a Paris aligned emission trajectory. The idea is to bring systems thinking to bear and to bring the whole ecosystem of construction and infrastructure around the Zoom so that suppliers, users of materials, designers, engineers, policymakers, that whole ecosystem come together to identify embodied carbon as a challenge, find out what are the barriers to change, what are the enablers to get over those. We call ourselves a do tank because it's about finding the problems, finding the solutions, and then sharing them with as many people as we can. We originally set up about 2 years ago, hoping for 40 members. Delighted to say we have 154. So it's an idea whose time has come. Construction and the building sector amounts to about 40% of our emissions. So it's a pretty big chunk, and it's great that the leading organisations across that ecosystem have come together to act on this. I suppose, Lisa, you asked for some points of momentum, what's been done. It's really about, so we have a website I'd encourage, I'll pop in the chat when I finish waving my hands around, with full of resources. So we've developed a dictionary of carbon so that we've got common language. We need to bust myths. The old timers who say, it's never been done, can't do that, I'm not changing, bullshit. We've now got over 24 case studies of where low emission materials have been used, where design has changed to reduce emissions, where digital design is used to utilize digital twins and cut emissions. We've got a really thorough discussion paper on all the different measurement frameworks for embodied carbon around the world. Top down if you're doing a whole precinct, bottom up if you're dealing with one component or one material. There's a lot out there. In terms of moving the conversation along, but moving impact, Neighbours, the National Australia Building Energy Rating Scheme, had embodied carbon on its radar for 2 or 3, 4 years down the track. They've brought forward their embodied carbon tool now. because of the industry appetite demonstrated through the activities of MECLA. So very delighted about that. South Australian government recently made an announcement that for its transport infrastructure group, capital works programs over $50 million, contractors have to have made a pledge to be on a net zero pathway to be eligible. From a supplier side, one of the major cement companies have said 2 years ago, 7% of their sales was their low emission product. Last year, it was 28%. So a couple of anecdotes just to point that the momentum really is starting to move. It's hard. It's a really complex sector, but delighted that what we want is for big projects and small to look at time, cost, quality, and carbon to be the success metrics. Don't build it if you don't need it, but if you must build it, those 4 criteria with carbon embodied and operational are important. I'll pop the link in the chat. Thanks for listening. Really encourage anybody for whom it's relevant, use our resources. It's all transparent, all open, and all working on that kind of common trajectory. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Hudson, and to the MECLA friends for all the important work you're doing. A great outcome of our last quarterly roundtable was connecting in MECLA friends with the local government working group to see what role local councils and cities can play in collaborating with those in the MECLA space. So that is hopefully leading to some positive outcomes across the local government sector. And that brings me to the great Alexi Lynch from Ironbark Sustainability, who is here to share an update with you all from the Local Government Working Group. Thanks for joining us, Lex.
Thanks, Lisa. Lex from the Local Government Working Group, co-convener, and I've also got colleague Imogen Jubb and fellow BFA Local Government Working Grouper Scott McHenry from EAGA on the line here as well, which is the Eastern Alliance for Greenhouse Action. Look, overall, I think our group, we think it continues to shine. It's been an amazing way to share info and work collaboratively. And in my view, it's probably one of the biggest void fillers, if you like, over the last 2 or 3 years in the broader local government and climate change land. At that high level, we're actually developing some new terms of reference to reflect this, the sort of way that it's sort of been it's become a lot broader than even just the original aims around advocacy and what the BFA aims are, and been a lot bigger than that now. And once confirmed, happy to pass it on if other groups wanted to adapt. I think there's a couple of things that I really want to point to. One is the release of, and I'm going to chuck this in the chat right now, a report by Cities Power Partnership called Many Hands Make Light Work. Of the 423 local government related reports that come out a year on climate change, to me, this is probably one of the best ever. And if you really want to sort of know what's going on in local government land and the sector and the real structural barriers that we face as a sector when it comes to reducing emissions, this is the best. So it was developed by Chris White, Portia Odell, and Kathy Oak. And it had input from a lot of local government stakeholders. And so it's not the sort of standard, hey, we need more funding for this, that, or whatever. It really talks about the key strategic things that we require around multi-level governance. Absolutely brilliant, even if you just want to read the first 2 or 3 pages. It also talks to the 3 key asks that we've had as a sector to the feds for the last couple of years, and we're continuing to push really hard on. There's a fair bit of advocacy, and we've been meeting with the feds a little bit with Varian Success and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So we're involved in talking to them about the Household Energy Upgrades Fund. Scott's been leading that with Lisa and others, and that's the 1.3 billion, basically trying to advocate for local government role in the rollout and making sure that we're helping vulnerable and low income communities. Councils have always had a pretty good success rate at working with their communities because they know their communities. Sometimes CFC or maybe the banks aren't as good at that. And so we're hoping that we can help out there. Trying to work with ALGA, the Australian Local Government Association, to try and sort of come into our group through events and through advocacy and some of the recent events that we've had in the last couple of months. So the Cities Power Partnership, which is from the Climate Council, had a massive event a few weeks ago in the Greenhouse Alliances as well. So there's been a lot of discussion around what the sector is doing. Some big themes around equity, First Nation justice, resilience, and disaster recovery. So it's interesting, there's always discussions about electrification of hydrogen and transport, but equity, just transition, First Nation justice and resilience has become a real theme over the last year. A couple of things coming up, which I'll finish on, is a local government review that we're going to put together that's going to involve surveying councils and trying to find out all the key and interesting things that are out there can be used for future advocacy, and a webinar that I would love, and we would love people to come to. It's on household electrification, the Household Electrification Summit for local government, been developed by Renew and Ironbark and Boundless. And we've got lots of partners that are coming to speak at this public webinar that I've just put into the chat there, at another workshop a couple of weeks later. But it's a real opportunity for councils to kind of really understand what's going on, get all the latest information, and then how we can best advocate in those areas. So please, I'll send that on afterwards as well, but that's the big one for us that we're trying to sort of push at the moment. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lex. Yes, lots of events and lots of reports from the local government sector, and the Many Hands Make Light Work, with the 3 shared asks from the largest collaboration of local government on climate initiatives ever is pretty great place to have the sector at. So please do jump into that report and find ways you can collaborate and get more multi-level collaboration across all levels of government and within all departments, across all departments, to get that comprehensive long-term climate response that Australia needs. So next up, we have Bethany Richards from the Investor Group on Climate Change, and the IGCC similarly pumps out a lot of great reports. So Beth, very keen to hear from you the key updates from the investor community working in the climate space. Thanks for joining us.
No worries, Lisa. Thank you for having me. So IGCC has 3 streams of work. We've got policy, corporate engagement, and investor practice. The policy team wrapped up a Canberra roadshow earlier this month, where we took 5 universal owner members to Parliament to discuss their concerns around rigorous climate-related financial disclosures. We've recently finished several submissions, including on the Capacity Investment Scheme and the Climate Change Authority's economic modelling. Senator McAllister launched our physical risk strategy at the IGCC summit last month, and we're currently engaging with various departments on Minister Bowen's sector pathways and are awaiting the AASB's release of guiding principles for disclosures. The corporate engagement team is busily liaising with members on their CA 100+ target companies, with the launch of phase 2 in full swing now. After consultation with investors, mining companies, and industry stakeholders, CA 100+ released the Net Zero Standard for Diversified Mining, which is a framework for investors to assess mining companies as they transition to net zero. This was a huge piece of work, so kudos to Danny from the IGCC team for working on this. The investor practice team has introduced 3 new working groups on real estate, private equity, and sovereign debt, which has been a very popular asset for improved management of among our membership of those assets. In terms of COP, Erwin Jackson, Marwa, Karan, and Jali from IGCC and AIGCC will be attending COP this year, and we've got several investors joining them. So we've got IFM Investors, Mercer, Hester, QIC, and Australian Super. Any questions, or if you want to touch base while they're over at COP, please let me know. I'll put my email in the chat.
Excellent. Thanks, Beth. Yes, very lots happening in the investor community, and it was great to see the Treasurer Chalmers Roundtable happen earlier this year. So keen to keep hearing updates on how that's all progressing and where we can work together. So to follow up from the Investor Group on Climate Change, we have Zhuyan Dong from Climate Energy Finance also joining us. So Nishta is part of the Corporate Finance Working Group and doing lots of emissions finance analysis with the Climate Energy Finance team. And Zhenyang's focus is on China, so would be very keen to hear updates and insights from Climate Energy Finance. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. My name is Jiyoung Dong. I'm from Climate Energy Finance, and we are a very new think tank that was just established last year. And we mainly work on research analysis on global financial issues that is related to global energy transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, as well as what the implication there are for Australian economy. And outside of Australia, our coverage also covers across Australasia area. For example, my job is covering China, and there are our director, Tim Buckley, he sometimes covers India as well. And we also have another analyst, Matt Pollard, he tracks the EV supply chain. So that covers a lot of part of China as well. And we also look at sort of coverage of technology trends in power, transport, mining industry, and looking for a better solution to accelerate this decarbonization. And my role is China Energy Policy Analyst. I'm mainly looking at China and trying to unpack China's trajectory of how they're doing the energy transition and what that might mean and what kind of opportunities that poses to Australia. For example, we had a report on, it's called Solar Pivot, that was out a few months ago, where we've been tracking the price drop of polysilicon and raw materials for solar panel. We can see with the expansion of manufacturing capacity from China, and the price has dropped more than 80% since the end of last year. And that has created a huge opportunity for other countries, including Australia, and how to, we're trying to also unpack how that can help Australia to transit faster as we are being left behind in terms of our own target. Outside of that, we also track other competition, like global renewable race, including the US IRA and sometimes India as well. And we're also trying to identify what could be our trade partner in terms of trading for a establishing cooperation on energy transition, or expanding our capacity in terms of renewables and with other like-minded countries, rather than just as our previous governments only tunnel vision of only doing things to please the US, where we advocate for Australia should focus on our own interests and how we navigate the competition in the global race. I will send those works in the chat later, and if there's anyone who's interested or have questions, we're happy to collaborate. We constantly doing a lot of brainstorming and collaboration with other think tanks, research institutes, and it's as well as a lot of other financial institutions as well. So I'll pop my email in the chat as well, and if anyone is interested, feel free to reach out. And we also have a line of work that we do a monthly update for China's energy mix on a national level, and just to see how China is pivoting, which is also because there were a lot of media that covers China, but sometimes it's not the complete picture. We're trying to paint the other picture. For example, most of the media will say China is the biggest coal consumer, which is true, but there's another half the picture is China is also the biggest producer for clean energy. And a lot of people will use the very incomplete picture from the media framing and as an excuse to be lazy, saying like, oh, China is not doing their work, why should we do our work? So we're trying to do a more comprehensive analysis to actually reveal what China has been really doing and what that meant for the rest of the economies. For example, we've been neglecting China's expansion in terms of solar manufacturing in solar, and then now EU is struggling because they can't really build up their own manufacturing capacity nowadays, because China has dropped the price down so much, and they have imported so many of China's solar panels, solar modules, and they're sitting in a garage, it is really harming sort of the local manufacturers based in the EU trying to expand their capacity. That is what we're trying to also to unpack. What China does certainly has a big implication on a lot of other countries as well. And we also track the policy, the interaction between the China's climate and energy policy and their on finance flows, especially within the Chinese SOEs. We have an upcoming report that's going to unpack 5 of the biggest Chinese energy SOEs and how they respond to the central government's climate policy and energy advocacy. And if anyone's interested, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that and for all the important analysis you're doing and sharing back with the broader climate advocacy community. And yeah, climate energy finance has made some great contributions to the discussions recently. So thank you so much for coming along. And apologies, Zhu Yang, I'll keep practicing your name and hopefully I'll get there. Wonderful to meet you. So next up, we have an update from representatives of the Health Working Group, the amazing Dr. Kate Wiley from Doctors for the Environment Australia and Chelsea Hunnessett from CAHA Climate and Health Alliance is also on the call. So I'll throw to you, Kate, and Jasmine too. Feel free to jump in if you have any contributions to make. Thanks, Kate, for joining.
Thank you, Lisa, and I do apologise for being late, everybody. I'm on Ghana land, also known as Adelaide, and my time zone, got a bit mixed up there. So, fundamentally, the Health Working Group is a conglomeration of a lot of the sort of climate and health groups in Australia, DEA, CAHA, Melbourne Climate Futures, Monash Sustainability Unit, ANU, etc. And we work together to try and do good things around climate and health in recognition that climate change is a health issue, even though most people seem to kind of not have that at the front of their mind. The biggest focus for us at the beginning of this year has been the National Health and Climate Strategy. So you may know that last October budget, Jim Chalmers put out 3 and a bit million, I always get it wrong, 3.7 million over 3 years for a National Health and Climate Strategy and associated unit, which sounds like quite a sensible thing. And so we've all been madly putting in our submissions about how that could work, how the health industry can both mitigate its own emissions, knowing that we're 7% of Australia's emissions, and also adapt to the climate health impacts, because they're big, they're here now. Everybody's seen the fires already and the heat waves already we're seeing in spring, and obviously this last European summer has been pretty confronting for everybody. So in recognition of that, our work going forward is looking forward to COP. Most of us in the group are members of ATTACH, which is the Alliance for Transformative Action in Climate and Health, which is a global alliance associated with the World Health Organization, where they're organising a health day for the first time at COP this year. This is quite a significant step forward for us. 3 years ago, health was not on the table at all. And then 2 years ago, it was a side event. Last year, it was a side event. This year, for the first time, it's in the main pavilion. So we're all pretty excited about that, trying to boost Australia's admission to around that event. Hopefully, we're trying to get Mark Butler along. Seems unlikely. Jed Kearney's probably going to come, Assistant Health Minister. And one of the things we're really advocating for is for Australia to increase its ambition in its NDCs. So, looking at health within the NDC, Australia is rated pretty poorly. We get 0 out of 16. I'll put the link in the chat for you all just to have a bit of a look at. Other countries seem to be able to consider health as part of our response to climate change. And Australia is hopefully coming to the party soon. I think that kind of is a good summary. I don't know if Chelsea wants to add anything or not. I'll just put that link in.
No, that was brilliant. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, any additions to that, Chelsea, or all good? Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. And yeah, it's been a very busy year for those in the health sector. And yeah, hopefully we can make this National Climate and Health Strategy really count and yeah, make the most of the first health day at COP. That'll be really exciting to see. So we also have with us Amanda Carl from The Next Economy. And Justin, I see you're on the call as well from the Hunter Jobs Alliance. So Amanda, do you have any updates for us on the National Net Zero Authority and other things that are happening in the just transition space? Very keen to hear about that. Thank you.
I didn't know I was going to be speaking. I'm sorry, I'm not very prepared. On the Net Zero Authority, so Greg Convey is leading the board on that and working with Prime Minister and Cabinet on the design of that. So he's undertaking some consultation at the moment with different groups around the scope of the Net Zero Authority. So there's not much update at the moment. What I'm hearing still is the timing will be there'll be recommendations put forward towards the end of the year to then draw up the legislation for the Net Zero Authority to go live, hopefully by mid-year next year. There's still a lot up in the air in terms of what the role of that authority is. The sort of points of contention are its focus. Is it really about helping coal regions to transition, or is it we're setting it up broader for the next couple of decades around supporting regions to decarbonise? Are they going to have their own money that they distribute, or is their role just to help direct existing funds that have been announced? And is their role simply coordination, or are they going to have more hands-on planning role? So those are the kinds of points that are up for discussion at the moment. Other updates. We've released a report today on the Latrobe Valley. We've been getting a lot of requests from, I guess, community members who feel that there's a lot of acceleration around the net zero in government and industry, but there's actually a lot of concern coming from very different sectors, and it's sort of already been touched on before, I think, by Lex, that if we don't engage people in more participatory and deliberative processes, which we can do, we've got the tools to do that, there is a risk that focusing too much on emissions reduction and technology could mean that we worsen outcomes in terms of social outcomes, justice outcomes, and even environmental outcomes. And there's a lot of opposition brewing at the moment to renewable energy developments, for example. So there's a bigger discussion that's happening around how do we do development well, any kind of development, and can we use the transition as an opening to actually address a whole lot of issues around the way we do development, which has kind of been informed by mining over the years. So what would it look like if we got our planning tools right? What would it look like if we actually engaged more people and put traditional owners front and centre, for example? So there's a growing discussion around justice, so watch this space. Some of it's coming out of the Northern Territory, and the Climate Justice Alliance has been growing up there. But it's also coming from different sectors like workers, small regional councils. So there'll be outcomes in sort of what does justice look like in that. And I'll finish up there. But check out the report we've just released today on the Latrobe Valley and engaging community leaders around what they want, because they haven't actually been that engaged in existing planning efforts to date.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Always really useful insights that you bring to these conversations. So sorry for putting you on the spot. So Justin, would you have any additions to make from the Hunter Jobs Alliance perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. For people who don't know who we are, we're in an organisation. We have 9 union affiliates and 4 environmental affiliates advocating for a orderly transition where we don't leave workers, the community or the environment behind. The things that we've been working on as a Hunter Transition Authority, so just in the state budget announced this week, they committed to 5.2 million to be shared across 4 authorities that align with the RESs across the state. Our view is it's not enough money, but it's a start to try and get on with it. So we'll be in the process of lobbying government to get more money. Like Amanda, we've met with Greg Convey to try and understand what the national authority and how it'll interact with the state authorities. They both basically have the same charters of jobs and investment. Greg was very much just doing the rounds and basically said he's getting his team in order, but made it quite clear to us that they won't be overlapping with what the Hunter Authority will do, which made it even more confusing. Seems they've got the same charter, so we'll keep an eye out of what happens in that space. The other projects we've been working on is what we term a new industries training centre to be established in the Hunter. So the Hunter Valley is attracting lots of investment. We've had announcements on offshore wind, hydrogen, solar, stuff like that. But to date, governments haven't invested in training for either transitioning workers or younger school leavers and that to find jobs and have the skills ready for these new industries that are coming. So we've commissioned a business case to make the case of where that could be in the Hunter. That could also service other parts of the state. That business case we're hoping to have done by the end of October, where again we will be advocating to state and federal governments that they need to invest in that training space so we can get on and move to these new industries and maximise local content.
Mm-hmm. And will you be heading along to the Zero Emissions Job Summit, the Clean Energy Council Summit next month, I think it is?
Yes, that sounds very interesting.
Jordan, would you be able to find the link and pop that in the chat? We have it from the chat we had with Kate last week. So thank you for those really useful insights. Lots of important work happening. So we're going a bit off schedule. Apologies for those of you prepared to give you a speedy updates. So there were a few people that said they could join us at certain times, and then Glenn's non-appearance, he must be very distracted with important discussions happening in the Big Apple. So if we have Beth Mitchell from Beyond Zero Emissions, we'd very much love to hear about the work that you're doing with renewable energy industrial precincts. And I heard rumours there was a lot of meetings and important events happening in Canberra last week. So thanks so much for joining us, Beth.
Awesome. I wasn't quite aware I was talking today either, so I'll join Amanda in that one. Obviously, last week was a very big week up at Parliament House with the announcement of a partnership looking to drive the government to invest $100 billion over 10 years in really revitalising the manufacturing sector in Australia to allow us to accelerate the transition to zero emission. There are a lot of meetings held with ministers. The basic feeling, I think, was that there were a number of ministers and MPs who thought that the $100 billion was a lot of money. In comparison, we talked about the amount of money that was required to get gas off the ground 10 years ago. And that was, I think, in the order of 300 billion, sorry, talking billion, not millions, billion, 300 billion over 13 years, and we're asking for 100 billion over 10 years. And so there's a real equivalence factor there as to that, how valid that figure is. Some of the MPs didn't flinch at it, and what was quite refreshing is that our finance minister didn't flinch at that figure. So that would be a sign of things to come with any luck. In relation to the REAP work that we've been doing, we have a paper coming out next week that really looks at the economies of scale of encouraging or incentivising, particularly safeguard mechanism facilities, to come together, aggregate their demand for efficiencies in the delivery of things like hydrogen pipelines and transmission. That work is currently under embargo, and you'll see that out next week. So I think the body of evidence, and particularly with announcements coming out of Western Australia around Pilbara, yes, I understand it is the big boys, but also recently around what Kwinana is doing and how large-scale batteries there delivering really great opportunities for grid security. But sadly, $1 billion worth of investment has gone across to China in grid scale batteries, and that's a real lost opportunity for Australia. So Beyond Zero Emissions is also working on a battery supply chain piece that focuses on grid scale batteries, and that's due for release in November.
Excellent. Always love hearing about the great work underway with Beyond Zero Emissions friends. Thank you so much for joining us, Beth, and apologies Heidi dogged you in without a full brief, but it's great that you could join us. So I think that's a really nice segue to Richie Merzian also joining us from Smart Energy Council. Richie, we'd love to hear about the renewable energy industry insights and the work you're doing with rewiring on electrification. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa, and hello, everyone. Carrying forward from where Beth from BZE left off, the Smart Energy Council, which is a peak industry group, about 800 renewable energy companies, co-hosted a renewable industry summit in Canberra last week. This was done in partnership with the ACTU. I think Dan might be speaking later, Dan Sherrill from the ACTU, and also in partnership with the Australian Conservation Foundation and the Climate Capital Forum, so which includes a couple of the groups who have been speaking today as well. So this was a real opportunity to bring together unions, industry and environment groups all around one clear call, which was for Australia's response to the Inflation Reduction Act and similar packages overseas to be similar in scale and in speed. And that collated around one number, which was around $100 billion that will be required for this package. That's a commitment from the Australian government. That'll be spread out over 10 years, so about 10 billion a year. It's not an excessive amount. And so that day was useful in bringing all that together and having a number of great speakers and ministers speak to that. And then over the course of the rest of the week, a number of climate groups, union groups and industry members met with, I think in total, between us all, about 60 MPs and ministers. So it was a real useful push for Australia to start thinking bigger in terms of how it needs to respond. And the feedback was that is a useful conversation to begin, that there was a bit of reservation around the size of the number, especially with the thinking around cost of living and inflationary pressures and other concerns that politicians have front of mind. But that is a conversation that also needs to be had publicly as much as privately behind closed doors up on the Hill. And so the real focus now is what moments can we use going forward to really have a conversation about how Australia needs to respond, what that size needs to be, and what does that actually look like in terms of support for clean energy build for new industries, and what type of support we're needed. Whilst it's useful having $2 billion for hydrogen in the Hydrogen Head Start or $1 billion for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to take forward electrification, really having support that's just slightly better than what you can find on the market is insufficient. We really need the Australian government to lean in and take a risk position and actually build the solutions here. That work is powering forward, given that there's a clear need to get a lot of those ducks in line ahead of MyEFO, and also ahead of, ideally, the visit from Prime Minister Albanese to the United States, to Washington, DC for his state dinner and meet and greet, given that the US and Australia have elevated climate in the compact they have together. There's a real question around what that looks like and whether the Prime Minister will have announcements ready to go. And so that work around clean energy exports and renewable energy generation is powering ahead. That's also part of a much bigger conversation, which I'll just share quickly, which is around a campaign that's brewing, and hopefully some of you have heard of it. Its working title is the Big Ask campaign, which is really how do you tie in clean energy exports, renewable generation, electrification, and adaptation and resilience into a much larger package for how Australia needs to respond to climate change. That campaign is brewing right now, and if you want more information around it, I encourage you to get in touch. The initial thinking is in its early stages, but really this is a campaign that's going to brew for the next couple of months and launch over summer. And it is building off a model that worked in the United States for how they went from the Green New Deal all the way to actually landing their Inflation Reduction Act. So I do encourage you to get in touch, and I'll drop my details in here. The other part to the Smart Energy Council's focus is really how do you deal with some of the problems that are arising, like the potential extension of Eraring, and how do you really reframe that entire debate, not around whether we should keep coal-fired power stations open, but how do we close them on time, and what levers are available to state governments in particular to unlock that. And also, and I think I saw it mentioned in the chat, there is a Senate inquiry around household electrification. The feedback we got from parliamentarians involved is that that could be used by the Liberal National Party to create a culture war around electrification. And so it's great to see a number of organizations feeding into that. I do encourage everyone, if you can, look at putting in even a simple submission into that, so that we can make sure that we're having the right conversations. As for those who did tune into the Bad Show Q&A on Monday, you'll see that the conversations we're having around electricity generation in this country are quite a mixed bag. And so we do need to direct it down a pathway that I think works for all of us. And finally, the Smart Energy Council is leading a delegation to China to look at a number of factories and new build sites, a whole variety of things in the clean energy space. I'll pop the details in there if that's of interest to any particular organization. That's taking place late next month, if you want to go see firsthand many of the things that Jiang was talking about. And then finally, on COP28, the Smart Energy Council will be putting on a couple of events there, hopefully some in the Australian Pavilion. I'll be attending, as will my CEO, and we're encouraging a number of our members to also attend. We see COP28 as being important, not just for the agenda around the global stocktake and climate finance, a number of other pieces, the health day, but also because that could be where Australia, the Australian government, secures the bid to host COP31. And if so, it'll be quite an important COP just for domestic purposes, because it'll be the starting point for the next journey over the 3 years between COP28 and COP31. And I think there's a real opportunity to frame what an Australian COP in partnership with the Pacific looks like, which is a key focus of ours. So if you want to have a conversation around that, very keen to do that too. And I probably went over time, so thank you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Richie. And yes, we are planning to attend the COP31 base camp on the 1st of November that's being organised by ImpactX, and currently in discussion with the organising team to make sure that the Pacific and First Nations voices in the program are much greater than currently on the program there. And Jordan has shared the link to that base camp event on 1st of November in Sydney with you all. So if you are able to send a representative or make it yourself, very much would love to hear your perspectives and contributions to that conversation. So thanks for the great work you're doing in helping to coordinate there too, Richie. So next, I'd love to introduce you all to Evan Center from the United Nations Global Compact for the Australia and Aotearoa region. And he has joined the team in the last year, I believe, and has a background from the US climate space. So I'll hand over to Evan. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'll just do a quick rundown. Sorry, I was late today. I just got off leave, and with the timing and everything, I couldn't get in till 11. But thanks for having me. I'll just give you a quick rundown. I'm Evan Center. I'm the Environment and Climate Change Manager at the UN Global Compact Network Australia. Just in terms of our key initiatives right now, we are working on building out our programming starting for next year on decarbonization, biodiversity, circularity, and also collaborating with our business and human rights stream on just transition activities. It's a lot to cover, right? So on the decarbonization side right now, we're wrapping up our Climate Ambition Accelerator. For biodiversity, we're just getting started. We are the Science-Based Targets for Nature Regional Outreach Coordinator for SBTN, and we're developing a strategy for next year to get early adopter organizations on board for setting science-based targets for nature within their organization. And also, we are in the second phase of developing a working group that hopefully we can spin off into a larger community of practice around science-based targets for nature. Circularity, we're just getting started with our circularity programming, but we have an event. It sold out in just a few hours in Sydney on the 12th of October. I feel like there's probably 20 events going on the 12th of October. Probably half of you are involved in them if you're here within Australia. But yeah, we have an event coming up in Sydney. And then in terms of policy advocacy priorities, we'll be looking to engage more in circularity, developing programming in Canberra, ideally next year. Biodiversity on that side, we're looking to spin off some things from our community of practice as we develop that out next year. And then also in terms of policy, we'll be looking to build up more oceans programming around the UN Global Compact Ocean Stewardship Coalition. Other than that, I've mentioned some of our upcoming events. We have an annual dinner coming up in October. We're looking at doing a reporting month in November with some webinars and some other programming focused around climate, nature, and social and governance reporting, kind of covering the ESG gamut right there. We'll just have some light touch workshops that should probably provide some really good technical advice as well. COP28 expectations, were supporting a lot of our participants. Just so you know, if you're not familiar with the UN Global Compact Network, our local network in Australia, and I think many of you are, I've seen some familiar names already on my grid. But we have about 300 participants. We have the majority of the ASX 20 and over 50 or actually almost 80 now listed organizations that make up our peak body membership. We call them participants, not members, but we reach out to them and we provide a lot of programming activities for them to give their voice more change. In terms of COP28, I'm working with some of our participants that are putting out larger cohorts, but we don't have any special significant advice, but we will be doing a lead up to COP28 webinar in early November as well. I'm always happy to collaborate on any of those spaces, massive spaces of decarbonization, biodiversity, and circularity. So if there's anything that you need or we can support with, just let me know. I think I cleared that up in 3 minutes. So if there's any questions for me or anything that you want to shoot me offline, just
Excellent. Thanks, Evan. It's very nice to have a peer in a very similar role. So it's great hearing about all the work you're doing. So there's also another announcement that Better Futures Australia is currently in the process of making a formal partnership with the Carbon Disclosure Project team to try and encourage greater disclosure of emissions from the corporate sector in Australia. So that's part of our accelerator role to the UN Race to Zero campaign. So we'll be working on developing out a platform and working with partners, hopefully including Climate Work Centre and the UN Global Compact and others on how we can make that work as effectively as possible and continue building that ambition in a rapidly evolving regulatory space. So we also have with us to come back to what Richie and Amanda and Beth and others were speaking to. Joining us is Elizabeth Sullivan from the Australian Conservation Foundation, one of the organisation members to the Sunshot Alliance. So thanks so much for joining us, Lizzie. Are there any key updates you'd like to share with us from the Sunshot Alliance?
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me and lovely to see all you wonderful people. Some of you are probably familiar with the initial Sunshot collaboration that came out in 2021, which is all about renewable exports and what they can do for Australia, for our economy and our climate. This year, the Sunshot collaboration was at that time made up of WWF, the Business Council of Australia, ACTU, and ourselves. There has since been an interim report earlier this year, but Accenture have gone forward and developed a third Sunshot report, which is coming out next month, which really delves into 4 key renewable manufacturing and industry areas, and they get a little bit more granular into the policy mechanisms necessary to unlock these industries and the kind of public finance that we'd be looking at, which would help catalyze the private finance around that. This piece of work sits inside of a larger body of work that I think the ACTU will be speaking to later, which is around at least $100 billion public sort of response to the IRA, a lot of people are calling it, or the Australian Renewable Industry Plan, which a lot of us here on this call are advocating for already. So Sunshot sort of sits as a small piece within that, and it's really focused on industry for export. And so we'll be shopping that around various bureaucrats and key ministers in Canberra next month. The collaboration looks slightly different, and it's more led by Accenture this time, but we all do support, the bones of the report. And like I say, it will be used to help prop up that broader piece of work. And if anyone has questions, please let me know. Reach out by email. Happy to chat further.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. So we're also expecting Dan Sherrill to join us. I'm not sure if he's on the call yet. Don't think so.
I know, Lisa, there's just another meeting that Dan's in till 11:30, so I'm not sure if he'll be here till after that.
Okay, no worries at all. So do we have any questions for any of the speakers so far that you'd like to come back to?
Haven't seen any in the chat, but feel free to raise them now if you have any.
I did have one for Rowan, but I think he's dropped off. So I've seen a lot of chatter about the submissions for the associated with the community energy upgrades and other funding. There was also a really good panel at the Local Government Climate Summit a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne with federal government representatives and the Victorian Minister D'Ambrosio and a representative of ALGA. And the amounts of funding that were being talked about for the local government sector relative to the 100 billion ask, I thought was quite interesting. So Lex, Scott, and others working in the local government space on the call, do you have any thoughts around how we can leverage the Many Hands Make Light Work report and the ask around multi-level governance to, I guess, inform more practical budget asks for the May budget next year?
How polite do I have to be about the $100 million that's coming from the federal government for stuff that it can just, we really appreciate the $100 million from the federal government to do projects that councils are kind of doing anyway. Obviously it's kind of like, it's good. It's for councils' operational emissions, right? And so it's for leisure centres, it's for electrification and for batteries. $100 million won't touch the sides. There's 537 councils in Australia. And so we're not really sure how that money will come out yet. I guess we publicly will speak positively about it and think this is great. And the sector will help councils with it. But I think the other thing is we can't pretend that this is that awesome. It's the kind of things that local government sector were asking for 15, 20 years ago. And 10 years ago, there was $200 million for exactly the same thing for the community energy efficiency program. So what we're trying to do is really shift that discussion and go, right, that's great. Now, can we actually look at the real game here? Because council can reduce their emissions within their operational, control, and they already are, which is great. And we certainly do need funding, mainly for those councils that can't afford it. But the much bigger thing is to even be saying to the feds, it's not about funding. We want to see some real structural changes in the way that we work with you, so we can all understand, the common barriers and the way that we can work together. So whether that's around planning, whether that's around transport, massive bloody EV changes coming up. Local governments are in control of so much parking stuff and, roads. The discussion sort of needs to be there. Councils can control 1% of the emissions within their municipality. The other 99%, that's what we kind of want to be talking about. And that's why those three asks are really consistent. And that's why that report, Many Hands Light Work, is just exceptional. The first 3 or 4 pages just sums it up so well to say funding, great, but this is kind of really where we need to get to. Was that polite enough, Lisa?
I don't know. What do you think, Scott?
Scott?
Yeah, I second everything what Lex just said. Just on those advocacy asks that have been part of the sort of local government pitch to other spheres of government, there is a lot of emerging evidence coming out from projects that work on the ground to understand the physical risks that climate is posing to local governments, and doing quantitative financial risk assessment, particularly to the physical assets. So what we're developing is a much clearer picture of council's exposure. So those advocacy asks are becoming much more informed by real evidence, and the clarity around costs also enable some more nuanced conversation around who should pay for what. So I think the advocacy is certainly getting sharper, and hopefully, with a bit of movement towards more structured conversation between the different spheres of government, we can have a bit of a clearer conversation around those shared risks, but also the shared objectives, and a bit more of an effective funding delivery model.
Yeah, thanks, Scott and Lex. I see your hand, Rachel, so I'll come to you. And I just thought it was super interesting from our meeting with the Assistant Minister McAllister and also the Clean Energy Finance Corporation that they're looking to you to provide them with the channels to get the information they need to roll out the federal programs. So it's a bit of a cart before the horse dilemma of not resourcing local government and the organisations that support them to do the work that they want to see happen rapidly and smoothly. Rachel, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was for Alexi, but it's partly answered by the two comments and the comment in the chat. But I was interested in that integration between climate adaptation and land use transition, and the kind of transition of towards net zero, from a local government perspective, and how much those things are being integrated in the advocacy you're doing. I'm asking this question mostly with, I work with the natural resource management sector, and that's another kind of conversation that we're always actively having about integrating all levels, from local government to regional NRM to, aligning with state and federal decision making, but around kind of embedding emissions reduction in land use, in better land use and land use that is climate resilient, that respects cultural values and biodiversity and so on. So yeah, how much of that kind of integrated thinking is part of it?
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Rachel. And Lex and Scott and Sally from the local government perspective, if you're stumped on how to answer, I feel like Emma and Tracy from Climate Work Centre might have some useful insights to add there too. Thank you. Lex, did you?
Oh, look, I'd love to take that one offline even, because that is probably the biggest gap still, I'd imagine, when it comes to councils and land use, and so it is one to discuss. And if I can just, Lisa, like when it comes to the comment I made about funding, you'll see that third ask of ours is around the understanding about kind of what it's going to cost for councils around resilience and adapting to climate change. And that is where we will need a ridiculous amount of money. That's where already councils, are spending money into upgrade assets and stormwater and heat resilience and all these sort of things. That hasn't ever really been discussed, and so that's part of what we want to do, find out what is this going to cost. And so my point was more around sort of energy efficiency funding, when we just need to think bigger. But it'd be great to have that one offline. Scott and Imogen might want to add to it as well. Land use planning, Scott?
Yeah, we've done some number crunching. I'll pop a link in the chat to a report that you can have a look at around the potential in the eastern region of Melbourne. But yeah, happy to have a follow-up conversation offline.
Can I respond directly to that point, Lisa?
Yeah, please, Amanda.
Yeah, so we are doing work with councils across Queensland and New South Wales at the moment in very different contexts. We're getting increasingly councils in quite rural contexts who, interestingly, are now coming to us saying, what is the role of council, but how do we actually also prepare for climate impacts? And what's interesting is in the discussion and the rub that comes up against what council can control versus what state and federal government. But interestingly, also in conversations with state governments, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria in particular, and the federal government and groups like ALGA, there's a convergence around questioning planning and approvals processes across the board. So it's not just how do we look at each sector, and the council is on the front line of this. How do you integrate climate impacts, climate adaptation and resilience? And a lot of it comes down to who approves what in like things like housing and urban developments, the built environment. So there's actually really, I don't know who's doing it, but there's a space, there's an opening at the moment to actually talk about how planning happens and where there's a disconnect between the different levels of government, and doing some sophisticated work on that. And I know that both Minister Catherine King and McBain are wanting advice on that. So if anyone's particularly interested in getting to the nitty-gritty around planning, let me know.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amanda. Beth, yeah.
On the same thing, Amanda and I were at the same roundtable last week where they talked about the regional investment framework. And I've just posted the link in the chat, but I guess the key two things that came out of there and with fairly broad consensus was the lack of detailed land use planning to understand what the land use values were across, at that resolution that makes sense to communities, and then also demographic planning so that the government can actually understand what's happening at the region from the human level and the spatial level as the sort of foundation pieces needed to move forward. But that framework is in the link and is ongoing work. Linda Scott was there from AMJ.
Thanks so much, Beth. And I just was finding the Climate Works Centre 9 recommendations for the federal government on net zero cities as well that might have some relevant pieces in that. Anna, I'm not sure if that's accessible online somewhere and there's a link to share, or if anybody's interested, they could reach out for a copy.
Yeah, I can't remember where it is. Sorry, I'm just back from long leave, so
I have a link, but I'm just not sure if I'm able to share it openly.
So I shared in the chat Beck Powell's email. So I'd say reach out to Beck because she's leading on our net zero cities work, and that is looking. It is an ask really for the federal, but it is looking at improving that link for cities as a whole between federal, state, and local. So yeah, and yes, Beck is indeed on the one of the working groups, local governance. Is it? I can't remember.
She's on our one. So all this stuff we're talking about. Yeah, she's awesome. So yeah, it's great. I think she might have sent that through to the draft to all of us. So it's absolutely perfect.
Great.
Okay, so I just put that link in the chat, and yeah, just keep to yourselves until we double check with Beck that that's open for sharing. Thank you. So we've got 4 minutes until Dan can jump on and join us to give an update on the ACTU, the Australian Council of Trade Unions actions. And we do have Jasmine from Australian Nurses and Midwifery Federation on the call, but yeah, there's probably a lot that Jasmine can't update us on in terms of the union's involvement in those conversations in Parliament last week. But in terms of other things you've heard from the speakers so far, key initiatives, particularly in the lead up to COP28. Was there any questions or comments you'd like to make outside of the chat, just to hear other people's perspectives, noting that Better Futures Australia, we are going to aim to put out a shared statement on Australia's expectations for Australia heading to the negotiations in Dubai. So we'd really value your contributions and thoughts on the top line issues that we should highlight there. And yeah, we do have a bit of a gap today with no active representatives of the Nature-Based Solutions Working Group, but Tracy is our newest member, hasn't actually joined the meeting yet, but they are planning they've postponed their Parliament event to early next year to understandably make space for the voice referendum and other key things that are happening in the next couple of months.
Lisa, if there's a bit of space right now, I just want to spend just a minute on the Big Ask campaign, if that's cool.
That would be amazing. Thanks, Richie.
And thank you. So for those who attended the Canada conference, they might have got a little snapshot of this or attended one of the 4 roundtables in the last week. But basically, the United States managed to nail down the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the world's largest piece of climate legislation, around $369 billion US, that was originally thought to flow towards electrification, clean energy exports, renewable generation, EVs. They're looking at that might be twice as much because their entire package is uncapped. But basically, the US's massive climate legislation came about from a small group of campaigners just really front-loading a campaign that became the Green New Deal. And so one of those who was involved intimately is Dan from the ACTU, who is an American but is now joined as their climate lead. And we're looking to replicate that here. So there's a small crew that's working on building a campaign that will really bring together renewables, exports, adaptation and resilience, and home electrification, tied together with a number of justice principles around First Nations, around delivering for all, around those who need it, get it most. And cooking that campaign up over the course of this calendar year with the intention of launching that in summer and running that through all the way to the federal election. That campaign will have a massive component around public narrative and mass mobilization. It'll have an inside track that's taking place here in Canberra now, which is what the summit and a number of those meetings were about last week. And it will also do lots of place-based work. So working in the Hunter, working in Latrobe Valley, working in a number of regions to really build a deep connection into the issues that people care about, those local asks, and tying them into the bigger asks that we have here. In order for this campaign to deliver a package bigger than anything else that's ever happened on climate change in Australia, we really need to build a massive coalition. And so the hope is that by the time this campaign is fully cooked and ready to launch in summer, that we'll have around 200 organizations on board with this. Right now, this is in its infancy, and I can see Dan Sherrill's joined, so he might continue from where I leave off. But basically, we're very keen to talk to you guys, get your thoughts, test out ideas on strategy, on culture and structure that we want to have, decision-making processes around the story and the narrative that we need to build, around how we get this off the ground, where we focus our place-based work, how we pull together mass mobilization. So we're very keen to engage with all of you around what that looks like, because the only way we're going to get this massive package is if it works for a number of us. So again, we'll pop down our details in there, but we're very keen to work with you all on how to make that all happen and to run through this so that it serves your organization as well. And with that, maybe I'll pass back to Lisa.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richie. And I think the reflection of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Green New Deal is a really positive one for a lot of the business and workers, stakeholders across the country. And there are some nuances and challenges happening within the Climate Action Network Australia conversation around critical minerals and First Nations country and other things that the challenges that would really value all of your thoughts and contributions to help us overcome those in a positive way. So now I have the pleasure, straight from his last meeting, to introduce you to Dan Sherrill, I'm sorry, Dan, I don't have your title in front of you, but the Climate and Energy Lead at the Australian Council of Trades Unions, and leading a lot of stellar efforts in those renewable industry discussions in Canberra and across the country. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
No problem, Lisa. And hello, everybody. Sorry I'm joining so late. It's been a hell of a morning, as it often is. But, and apologies, I'm sure my comrade Richie has already gone over a lot of really important territory, so if I'm repeating him, do let me know. But I think I wanted to take a step back and sketch out the advocacy landscape broadly around climate solutions that Richie spoke about in the last section, because there's sort of two meta processes happening across civil society that ACTU is involved in, at least. I'm sure there are more, that are bringing together this really powerful potential political coalition of unions, renewable industry, climate movement, and First Nations leaders, and hopefully expanding beyond that, but that's sort of the core. The first path is the big ask, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but Richie, I take it from the words of yours I caught that you just went over that. Parallel to that, there's a process happening right now that some people may have clocked onto around something called the Australian Renewable Industry Package. So, God, what was it? Last week, a number of organizations came together through a summit in Canberra, followed by a really amazing and successful lobby day, to launch into the discussion in Canberra the need for an $100 billion Australian renewable industry package that would both scale clean export and manufacturing industries in this country to embody the vision that some people refer to as the renewable superpower vision, and secondarily to accelerate the build out of renewable generation so that there are enough green electrons in this country to actually power industries of that magnitude. And at the center of that, making sure to embed social good principles around the kinds of jobs that are being created in those industries, the kind of community benefits that are flowing to the communities that host them, particularly for First Nations communities, and how those projects are dealing with minimizing inadvertent impacts on nature. The launch of that package was in response to a very particular moment we're facing right now with the Australian government, which is, people probably clocked in last year's budget. The government announced that by the end of this year, so by December of 2023, it would be putting together a package that it is construing as an Australian response to the Inflation Reduction Act. And what it really means when it says that is like, we need a package that relevels the playing fields for subsidies in terms of clean export and manufacturing industries and renewable generation based on what happened with the IRA, so that Australia can get back in the game in this global race to the top on clean energy. And so that is not everything we have to do on climate solutions. As Richie probably mentioned on the big ask, they're incredibly important public investments that Australia needs to make in things like household electrification and efficiency, in public transit, in climate readiness, ecosystem remediation, climate smart agriculture. All of these things are not within the scope of the government's near-term process, because investments in those things in the US or the EU, they don't see as affecting Australia's relative competitiveness to do the same thing. So this is not, the Australian Renewable Industry Package that was launched was not intended to be the end-all be-all for the public investments we need to see on climate solutions, but it was intended to set a really high bar of ambition, both in scale and in what I would describe as justice principles or social good principles for the government in its specific near-term process that is ending by the end of this, that they are required to come up with a result with by the end of this year. That launch was, I would say, in broad strokes, really successful. We got press basically everywhere. We had 45 plus meetings in Parliament House, the tenor of most of which was pretty positive. Like nobody said, leave the room, you're nuts, this is never going to happen. There was like hemming and hawing about the exact scale of ambition and the exact particularities of how you attach social good to the advent of these industries. But by and large, we came away with a sense that they're going to do something in this space, and we're pushing on an open door with regard to that, but we have to keep pushing to make sure it meets our standards of ambition and social good. So that's all really, really useful. But it's not everything we need, right? So by the beginning of next year, as Richie described, there's this big ass campaign. It always sounds like a big ass campaign, which it will be, but it's a big ask campaign. That will be, whereas the Australian Renewable Industry Package was a reactive push in response to a specific government process, and to date has frankly mostly involved like relatively inside baseball tactics in Canberra. The Big Ask campaign is much more proactive, built by movements for movements. It is looking to expand the scope of climate solutions we need to invest in to include actually the whole diamond, everything we need, both the export and manufacturing and renewable generation, along with the household level electrification and efficiency, and everything contained in the broad bucket referred to as climate readiness. So to set that giant scope and then to have a really public-facing campaign that centers ordinary people and the benefits that they would receive from the passage of something of this scale of ambition. The thought there is like, to win that, we will need to push hard and collectively and continue to grow over probably some number of years. Obviously, in late 2024, 2025, we're going to have a federal election in this country that provides a key leverage point. And then in 2026, it looks very likely that Australia will be co-hosting a COP with our partners in the Pacific Island nations that also provides a key leverage opportunity. And essentially, the meta goal here is like, by the time we host that COP, Australia has passed something on the ambition of what the Big Ask cohort is putting together, and have, in so doing, skyrocketed from a global laggard on climate to like a genuine leader we can be proud of and that can stand alongside our Pacific Island nations with pride, saying we've really instigated a step change on climate policy ambitions when it comes to investing in the solutions. So just want to sketch out those two tracks. One, reactive, which is, I'm not using a bad term, just the reality, pouncing on a political opportunity, relatively short term, relatively inside game. The other, proactively building out the larger narrative, focus on the public, and more of like a 1 to 3 year campaigning arc is what's being thought of. And those two things will have to, by the beginning of next year, when the Big Ask campaign is considering launching, those two things will have to dovetail in a conscientious way and sort of have the Australian renewable industry package roll up into the Big Ask diamond. That's something that Richie may have referred to. So that's all a lot, and this is like very meta grand strategy stuff. Obviously, like a lot of conversations happening underneath this and to the side of this that are also really important. But that's on the massive investments in climate solutions front that Australia needs to make and is not currently. That's sort of the landscape presentation that I wanted to give. So that's helpful, Lisa.
That is really helpful, Dan, and it's we missed you in the earlier parts of the conversation, but I understand you're trying to fit a lot into your day. So there's a lot of complementary threads that others have shared with transition pathways and sector decarbonisation work. So I think there's going to be a huge opportunity for everyone on this call to play a role in bringing in those voices from all parts of Australia, all corners of society and the economy, to speak to what that means in practice for them in their sector, in their community, in their workplace. So yeah, really positive opportunities ahead. And then our colleague Kavita at Climate Action Network Australia is also working incredibly hard to try and strengthen the relationships of all of us in Australia with our Pacific neighbours to see how we can more constructively collaborate in the lead up to COP31. So lots of important work ahead. Any questions for Dan from anyone still with us? No. All right, I think there was a lot of information there for everyone to digest. And Dan, very, very keen to share any updates from your efforts last week through the BFA channels, if you have any links and things to share. And we'll send around a summary trying to draw out the key pieces and complementary areas, opportunities for collaboration from what we've heard today. And just a reminder, we'll also be compiling that shared expectation for the Australian delegation heading to Dubai. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox, and also for my chasing phone calls and texts to all of you. Greatly value all your advice and input. Whether or not you are happy to add your logo is up to your leaders. So we'll be happy with where we get to with that. Also, the announcement that Jordan made at the start of the meeting in the chat that Better Futures Australia is planning its third forum for October next year, timed to help set the narrative in the lead up to Australia's next federal election, as we did back in 2021. So would greatly value all of your organisations partnering with us around that to really make that moment count and set the political platforms and the agenda for where it needs to be to make sure that we as a country keep ratcheting ambition and don't let that complacency settle in like it looks like it's threatening to. So keep an eye out for those updates from us, and please do let us know if you're planning to head to COP, because we also have a bunch of Global Alliance for Climate Action side events and other things that, if you're looking for a dinner invitation or some cocktails or with the climate champions or other things, happy to feed you into those. And then, yeah, please do keep these conversations going. We'll try and capture all of the commitments in the chat for follow-up meetings and make sure you're introduced and can set those and get those conversations happening. And yeah, if you're not already subscribed to the BFA channels and our social media, please do that. But otherwise, a huge thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your busy lives to share your valuable insights and updates on the critical work that you're each doing. Please pass on our gratitude and thanks to your teams and allies out there. And please do keep doing what you're doing. Thank you for all you're doing. And I'll just also provide a special thanks to Tessa Vincent from the UN Climate Champions team for jumping on to record that update for us from the UK. And fingers crossed we get some more positive outcomes, like Michael Bloomberg's commitment for another 500 million to end coal and phase out gas in the US. So it's going to be a big couple of months ahead. I think I saw somewhere someone referred to it as the summit season. So good luck, everyone. And yeah, thank you so much.